Chapter 11. So good. Abby lay in a dazed and boneless heap, congratulating herself on a most excellent idea. Endorphins surged through her body and muted the pain. From the day's hike, Roarke had given her pleasure, and now he was keeping her relaxed muscles warm by resting lightly against her. He must be supporting himself on his knees and forearms, because his full weight would be too much for her to handle, but this was nice, more than nice. She felt cared for, especially when he combed her hair aside to kiss the nape of her neck and the curve of her shoulder. When he began to gently nibble, she became aware of several things. First of all, she wasn't quite as satisfied as she'd thought. She'd be more than happy to go another round, although that wouldn't be very sporting of her. Technically it was Roarke's turn. That brought her to the second item demanding her attention. Roarke's package rested lightly but temptingly between her thighs. As she knew from the blackmail picture she'd taken in the woods, he was possessed of a very large package. She'd promised to unwrap it for him, which she was more than willing to do. But now that his solid length was nestled against her, she'd become greedy. She wanted the full experience that package could provide, and she couldn't have it. Why hadn't she tossed some condoms in her backpack? They wouldn't have weighed much. In fact, ounce for ounce, they'd have delivered far more pleasure than the energy bar she'd tucked in a side pocket. Roarke settled more firmly between her thighs as he nuzzled a spot behind her ear. Instinctively, she shifted her weight to her knees and lifted her hips to accommodate him. Drawing in a sharp breath, he slowly fit himself tight against her, but the soft denim of his jeans kept her from the connection she really wanted. Then, he rocked forward, nudging the spot that was already wet and ready for him. She moaned in frustration. His breathing quickened. Swearing softly, he nipped her earlobe. Then he pushed forward again, more insistently this time, and the crease of his fly rubbed in an erotic rhythm that made her gasp with pleasure. Bracing herself on her forearms, she answered his rhythm as heat pulsed in her veins. Roarke, I want. I know. Sliding a hand beneath her, he tunneled his fingers through her damp curls. No, he didn't know. She wanted more than an orgasm. She wanted him to remove the denim barrier to ecstasy and connect the way a man and woman were designed to do. But that was irresponsible and crazy, so she'd take what she could get. Stroking her with a sure touch, he rocked against her, his jeans-clad thighs brushing her backside. You're killing me, Abby, he said in a low, roughened voice. She was too far gone to respond. Instead, she uttered a soft cry as the first wave of her climax rolled through her. Then her world erupted in an orgasmic flow of light and heat that left her breathless with its power. If he could give her this much pleasure with a mere touch, maybe she wouldn't survive a full dose of Roarke's loving. But she'd like to try. As she trembled in his strong grip, she longed for what she could not have. Gradually her breathing steadied, but Roarke's had not. She vowed to make good on her promise and give him some relief from what had to be incredible frustration after providing her with 2 climaxes. She took a shaky breath. Roarke, it's okay. Slowly he released her and the air stirred as he moved away. I need to leave for a little bit. Leave. She rolled to her back and sat up. But it's pouring out there. Doesn't matter. He stood on the far side of the cave, his back to her as he pulled off his hiking boots. Next he removed his jacket and then his shirt. He was stripping down. Her chest grew tight. Sometimes she forgot who and what he was, but it appeared she was about to get a vivid reminder. Are you going to shift? Not here. Her immediate tension eased a little. Capturing it on film was one thing. Watching from a few feet away was a whole other deal. She swallowed. But why? I thought that you would want me to. She wasn't sure how to put it into words without embarrassing herself. In some ways they knew each other very well, but in others not at all. He kept his back to her as he shoved his jeans and briefs down. I did. Still do. But it wouldn't be wise right now. I'm thinking with my dick. Oh. Now that he'd mentioned it, she wouldn't mind a glimpse of that part of his anatomy. She calculated the chances of that and decided they were pretty good, considering he'd have to turn in her direction in order to walk out of the cave. A quick run in the rain will cool me down. He turned. Stay. It was the only word that her lust-crazed brain could come up with. Once she'd seen what she'd be missing if he left. The camera hadn't done him justice. The light from the electric lantern revealed a magnificently erect penis surrounded by dark blonde hair, and his balls swollen and tight with excitement begged for her touch. He glanced at her, regret in his green eyes, his powerful chest sprinkled with the same shade of dark blonde hair surrounding his cock, heaved in a tortured sigh. It would be a mistake. Then he took his gorgeous body out of the circle of light from the lantern. No, it wouldn't, she called after him, but he didn't answer. The bush covering the cave entrance rustled, indicating he'd stepped outside. Grabbing up a sleeping bag, Abby wrapped herself in it as she hurried after him. Roarke, this is silly. Come back. But he was gone, using the cold rain she supposed as a natural version of a cold shower. She could use one too after getting a good look at Roarke's equipment that she wouldn't be touching anytime soon. Tossing down the sleeping bag, she shoved past wet branches and gasped as the cold rain struck her heated skin. Roarke! She pushed her hair out of her face and peered into the darkness. Still no answer. She tried to listen for him as rain pelted her head and streamed in rivulets down her body. She shivered in the cold. Something rustled to her left, and she turned in that direction. A shadowy form rose from the forest floor about 20 feet away. Her throat constricted and her heart thundered as she stared at the shadow. Was it man or beast? When it wheeled and loped away through the trees, she knew. She stood there a moment longer in hopes the cold rain would drum some sense into her. What in the name of heaven was she thinking, getting sexually involved on any level with a creature that could be a man 1 minute and a wolf the next? Sure, he had a hell of a Johnson, but she was a sensible adult woman who could look beyond that kind of eye candy. Her mission in coming out here had nothing to do with sex, and she needed to remember that. She was here because she wanted to confirm Grandpa Earl's Bigfoot sighting. Period. End of story. Werewolf sex hadn't been part of the bargain. She'd allowed Roarke's personal magnetism to cloud her judgment, but she wouldn't let that happen again. Yes, she'd been treated to a couple of really nice orgasms without returning the favor, but that was his problem. He'd left and turned into a wolf. If he preferred running around on all fours in the rain to sitting in a cozy cave with her, that was his choice, but she had other plans. Food sounded good right now, along with a rub-down with her camp towel and putting on dry clothes. Moving the branches covering the entrance, she ducked back inside. Roarke kept watch until Abby went back inside the cave. Although he didn't sense any danger nearby, he wasn't about to run off and leave her standing naked and vulnerable in the rain. Naked and beautiful, too. No wonder he'd nearly forgotten himself back in the cave. He'd gazed with longing as rain had slipped lovingly over her shoulders, her taut nipples, and her supple thighs. Raindrops traced paths he longed to follow with his tongue. He didn't dare. Not now that he understood the power of this attraction to ruin both their lives. He'd been close to unzipping his jeans and taking her. Too damn close. Realizing that had scared him enough to push him out of the cave before he acted on that impulse. He'd bought into her concept that they each needed to blow off some sexual steam, and maybe that had worked for her. It wouldn't work for him. She would have been more than willing to provide him with a release in a similar way, but it wouldn't be enough, and now he knew that. Better to stay away from sex completely. Once Abby was safely in the cave, Roarke took off at a run. How he loved the feel of his wolf muscles stretching and contracting. His large paws sent pine needles flying and filled the air with the sharp tang of evergreens. The run would calm his unruly libido, but that's about all he'd accomplish. Loping around the forest, they were too far from the Bigfoot pair to make that journey. He'd have to leave Abby alone for a good part of the night, and he wasn't willing to do that. She would probably be fine, but he couldn't guarantee that, and besides, he'd promised to be back soon. So he traveled in a circle, always staying within a 10-minute radius of the cave entrance. The rain drenching his coat kept the other creatures inside nests and burrows for the night, although a werewolf in the forest tended to make that happen, too. That meant the only sounds were those of his paws hitting the forest floor and the steady pounding of the rain against the leaves. Then he heard a noise that had nothing to do with the forest, and everything to do with humans. Someone had started playing "Oh Susanna" on a harmonica, and not well either. Roarke paused and faced the direction of the sound, wincing at more than one sour note. He was upwind of the harmonica player, which was why he hadn't caught the scent of another human in the area. Damn, as if he didn't have enough problems. He'd have to check this out and then notify Abby that they weren't alone. With luck it was a hiker and not a Bigfoot enthusiast. Either way Roarke would have to be more vigilant and make sure he and Abby weren't followed. Moving silently through the trees toward the sound of the harmonica, Roarke decided that a bad harmonica player was better than someone who made no noise and could go undetected, especially if they were downwind. Roarke didn't like to be taken by surprise. Finally he could see the tent sitting in a small clearing, dome-shaped and glowing from a lantern inside. It looked like a giant stoplight except for the peace sign created with duct tape that decorated the back panel. Whoever owned the tent wasn't going for camouflage. Then Roarke remembered reading a Gonzo article claiming that Bigfoot was naturally curious and liked bright colors and shiny things, sort of a Bigfoot as packrat theory. It wasn't true, but a few Bigfoot hunters had latched onto the idea because it gave them another technique for making contact. Roarke wanted to be wrong in the worst way, but he was afraid he'd just found someone from the Bigfoot fringe element. Keeping well hidden by the trees, he circled around to the front of the tent. The front flap was propped up to serve as a canopy, and the harmonica player sat cross-legged in the doorway. He smelled musty, as if he might still believe in storing his clothes in mothballs. Roarke took note of that so that if the guy popped up on his sensory radar again, Roarke would know who he was dealing with. Next he made a visual check. The camper looked to be about Roarke's age, but there the resemblance stopped. Current state, but as a human Roarke was taller, in better shape, and had better eyesight. This guy obviously needed his black-framed glasses or he wouldn't have them on out here in the woods. Roarke wondered if his outfit was designed to attract Bigfoot too. The fluorescent orange sweatsuit made him look like a traffic cone and clashed in. Good thing Bigfoot was colorblind. Roarke wished he could be, at least for the next 5 minutes. The guy deserved props for nerve, though. Not everyone would hike into the woods alone and deliberately try to attract a creature reputed to be nearly 10 feet tall and weigh close to 500 pounds. Roarke wondered what the harmonica player planned to do if he actually attracted a Sasquatch into his camp. He wouldn't, of course. The creatures were terminally shy besides being colorblind. If Roarke were looking for a good match in the world of nature, he'd compare the Sasquatch to a tarantula, big, hairy, and scary, but with poor eyesight and a tendency to flee rather than fight. As Roarke watched from the shadows, the guy tapped his harmonica on his sleeve and brought it back to his mouth. When he launched into a god-awful rendition of Amazing Grace, Roarke stifled an urge to howl in protest. Enough. He'd ID'd the interloper and recorded his scent. If Roarke and Abby were unlucky enough to cross paths with him, Roarke would know what he was up against and find a way to send the guy off in a different direction. Melting into the shadows, Roarke headed for the cave. Partway there he caught the scent of food warming. Abby must have decided to fix dinner. Good. They could occupy themselves with eating and cleaning up. He'd tell her about the harmonica player, and then they could both go to bed separately. But the closer he came to the cave, the less he believed in that scenario. Food wasn't the only thing he could smell. Apparently Abby's special aroma had become firmly seated in the pleasure center of his brain. One whiff and he was a moth to flame. By the time he reached the spot where he'd shifted earlier, he'd started to rationalize. He'd been hiking all day and now he'd just had a good run, so logically he'd be tired tonight. If he had sex with Abby, no doubt he'd conk out immediately afterward. No special significance, no big deal, just good hot sex. But he needed the full program to be completely satisfied. He'd have to explain to her why they could do that without a condom, but that might not be difficult. So they'd have sex once and both fall asleep right after. Sounded like a reasonable plan as he lay on the wet ground and moved through his shift. Moments later he stood and brushed away the pine needles clinging to his skin. The rain continued to come down, and it washed away streaks of mud on his arms and legs. He scrubbed his hands through his wet hair, working out any leaves tangled there. As he plucked a leaf from his pubic hair, he was forced to acknowledge that his interest in having sex with Abby was already evident, but fortunately he wouldn't walk in quite as aroused as when he'd walked out. The run had worked. Temporarily. Her scent drifted out to him from the cave. He decided at that moment that dinner could wait a while. Sex first, then food. After that, they'd be sated from both activities and they'd fall asleep immediately. It sounded like the perfect ending to the evening. His goal clearly in mind, He held back the branches of the bush covering the opening and called out to her. Abby, I'm back. Good. Don't fall over your clothes. I found some dry ones in your pack and put them right by the entrance for you. Thanks. That didn't fit in with his plan, but he could carry them into the cave and put them on later before they ate dinner. Be sure to get dressed before you come in here, Roarke. Why? He picked up the bundle of clothes he found neatly stacked and waiting for him. Because we're both staying dressed from now on. Having sex is a complication neither of us needs, and you obviously realized it earlier. No, I just wanted to dial it back some. He continued walking into the cave. She glanced up from the pot she was stirring and frowned at him. I've decided to dial it back completely, so put those on, please. She'd braided her wet hair into a single strand hanging down her back, which made her look prim and almost virginal. He took that as a challenge. I mean it, Roarke. She tapped the spoon on the side of the pot and laid it on a metal plate beside the camp stove. I'm sure you do. He studied her outfit, green knit shirt revealing the unmistakable outline of a bra, black lycra pants, probably with panties underneath. At least her feet were bare, but he had some undressing to do before he could institute his plan of action. She stood and folded her arms. I realize that in a sense I owe you a... He smiled. In a sense I suppose you do. But we're very different, Roarke. I should hope so. That's why things fit so beautifully. You know what I mean. We're from completely different worlds. Better to leave well enough alone. You're the one who blackmailed me into bringing you along on this trip. Abby. She focused on the cave wall rather than look at him. For Grandpa Earl's sake. Then how about the fact you're also the one who suggested not so long ago that we could fool around and release some of our pent-up sexual energy? She blew out a breath and gazed up at the ceiling of the cave. I made a mistake, okay? I now realize that there's too much temptation to throw caution to the winds. Without any condoms, we're taking a huge chance that we'll get carried away, and I know neither of us wants to deal with that consequence. What if there was no consequence? Her startled blue gaze met his. You found a box of condoms in the woods? That made him laugh. No, he dropped the clothes to the floor of the cave. There's something I didn't explain about werewolves. We can't impregnate anyone until we find our mate and pledge ourselves for life. It's a great system. She rolled her eyes. Oh please. That story's even worse than the old standby of having mumps as a kid. I know guys will go to great lengths to get out of wearing a little raincoat, but I thought you'd be different considering the stakes. You don't believe me? He was stunned. He'd thought all he had to do was explain and they'd be good to go. Why the hell not? Sorry, Professor Wallace, but if what you say is true, you would have told me. When I first brought up the issue of condoms, you neglected to do that, so ipso facto, you're making this up as you go along. I am not. I thought we needed to have some sort of braking system on our relationship, and that was a good one to use. She regarded him with narrowed eyes. So you normally go around having free sex, do you? He had a feeling he'd said the wrong thing. Only with other werewolves when we're both in human form. Obviously I can't explain this to a woman without revealing I'm a werewolf, so I use a condom with humans. You would be an exception to that rule because you know I'm were. She stepped back and held up both hands. Spare me from being the one exception. Condoms serve another purpose besides birth control. If you've had lots of free love with your werewolf girlfriends, bully for you, but I'd rather not participate in that boink fest. Thank you very much. I haven't had lots. He was getting testy from sexual frustration combined with a need for food. And werewolves are resistant to disease if that's what you're worried about. How convenient to be disease resistant as you put notches in your belt. Notches in my... Damn it, Abby, I'm not that kind of guy. Then you would have leveled with me in the beginning, wouldn't you? Look, you might as well get dressed because I don't buy your story and we're not having sex. You'll have to settle for reconstituted beef stew. Whatever happened to the concept of me teaching you about werewolves? Let's just say that you have a credibility problem. When you're dressed, I'll dish the stew. He stared at her. The set of her jaw and the glint in her eyes told him that she dug in her heels and wasn't going to budge. He wasn't giving up, but he might as well back off for the time being, so they could have dinner and then sex. That could work too. Chapter 15. Roarke got dressed faster than Abby did, so he quickly hauled out his safety. razor and managed a quick shave. He'd worried about scratching her this morning, but he was also thinking of the future. He still had much to explore. When it came to Abby, he'd promised himself to kiss all her freckles, and he hadn't done that yet. He also had hidden riches to taste. He'd hate to irritate her sensitive thighs. While he was savoring those riches, by the time he'd finished with his shave, Abby had her clothes on and was putting her hair in a ponytail. The gesture reminded him of last night in the rain when she'd worked shampoo into her hair and caused her breasts to quiver with emotion. He'd be wise not to spend too much time thinking about last night or the hot wetness of her this morning, when she'd insisted she wasn't willing to have sex with him. She'd been more than willing, and he'd known it. She couldn't fool him when his excellent sense of smell gave him all the information he'd ever need about her readiness. To think he'd expected Donald's presence to slow them down. Hell, he'd very quickly realized he wanted to make Abby cry out during sex so that Donald would have no doubt Roarke was the alpha male around here. Even someone as geeky as Donald brought out Roarke's need to mark his territory. But he hadn't gone into the cave with sex on his mind. He'd only meant to see if Abby was awake so he could let her know his plans regarding Donald. Then he'd walked in on a werewolf's fantasy, a naked, voluptuous woman on her hands and knees facing away from him on the stone floor of a dimly lit cave. On top of that, her scrubbing action had made for some interesting hip movement, almost as if she were taunting him with her availability. Of course, she hadn't been. She didn't understand the sexual subtleties of a werewolf's mind and probably wouldn't have time enough to explore them. But thinking about Abby on the cave floor still got him hot, even though he'd just had sex with her. She had no idea what a temptation she'd unwittingly presented this morning. He deserved credit for not taking her on the spot. Sure, that action would have had serious consequences for both of them, but unexpectedly discovering her on all fours had awakened powerful instincts that he had trouble taming. He was already half in love with her, and that combined with lust could easily have trumped logic. Somehow he'd controlled himself. But when she'd continued to stand there in all her naked glory, he decided to claim his consolation prize. A consolation prize is when it was a pretty good one and certainly a safer route than the action that had instantly flashed into his head when he'd first glimpsed her bare and very provocative backside. All righty. Abby walked over as he was stowing his razor in his backpack. I'm ready to meet Donald. Okay. I'm thinking after we get the introductions out of the way, the next step is coffee and breakfast. She smiled at him. Worked up an appetite, did you? You could say that. You shaved. She touched his jaw. Was that on my account? As a matter of fact. He cradled her face in both hands and tipped it up so he could examine her freckled skin. I irritated your skin a little when I kissed you this morning. I feel bad about that. No worries. I think you look kind of dashing with stubble. Thanks, but stubble gets in the way of certain activities. Like kissing. Leaning down, he brushed his mouth over hers. Like that. And other fun stuff. I can't imagine what you're talking about. Then imagine this. He put his mouth close to her ear and told her in graphic detail what he had in mind for the next time they were alone and naked. Roarke. She pulled away from him and pretended to look shocked, but her eyes grew dark and sparkly. You, sir, are no gentleman. I never claimed to be. I'm a werewolf, Abby. We have voracious sexual appetites. That's an understatement. She fanned her pink cheeks. If I didn't know better, I'd suspect you of deliberately planting that idea in my head so I'd think about it all day. Me. Will you think about it all day, Abby? Probably. Good. Abby stepped out of the cave into the pearl-colored light of an overcast day. Empty Hood, the most dominant feature of the area on a clear day, was still covered, but no moisture fell from the sky. She almost missed being pelted by raindrops. From now on, a rainy day would remind her of being here in the woods with Roarke. Ah, there you are. A pudgy guy in a bright orange sweatsuit jumped down from the rock he'd been sitting on and walked toward her. His fluorescent green ball cap carried the slogan Bigfoot Lives across the crown. She stepped forward and offered her hand. I'm Abby Winchell. And you must be Donald Smirts. You've heard of me? He pumped her hand enthusiastically, behind thick lenses. His eyes were a pale gray with surprisingly beautiful dark lashes. From Roarke. Oh, I thought maybe you'd read some of my articles in cryptozoology today. I'm multi-published in that journal. Sorry. She extricated her hand from his grip. I'm new to the study of Bigfoot. So you came up here all by yourself? I did. He puffed out his chest. I thought of taking along my peeps on this quest, but then I told myself, Donald, my boy, strike out on your own. Self-reliance is a good thing. Abby glanced over at Roarke, who was standing to one side, arms folded, as he watched Donald's performance. The performance obviously wasn't over. Donald lifted one finger toward the sky. I said to myself, be your own person, Donald smirks. Take that equipment you invented and prove that you're an engineering phenom. Follow your heart. Punching his fist into his chest, he promptly doubled over in a coughing fit. Abby moved toward him. Are you all right? Sure. Probably got some fruit leather caught in my throat. Let me help. Abby moved into position and whacked him between the shoulder blades, but nothing popped out of his mouth. She pretended not to notice. Better. Much. Donald took a deep breath. That fruit leather can be wicked stuff if you get a piece crosswise in your windpipe. I'm sure. Donald straightened and adjusted his ball cap. I understand. Congratulations. Are in order. For what? Hello. Marriage. Holy matrimony. The tie that binds. Roarke stepped forward and put his arm around Abby. You'll have to forgive my bride. She's still not accustomed to thinking of herself as a married woman, probably because the rings I ordered never arrived. So no engagement ring for Abby and no wedding rings for either of us. She took note of how easily he created that story to explain the absence of rings. He was a smooth one, this Roarke Wallace. His story about not needing condoms better not be just another smooth lie. If she turned up pregnant with shapeshifters, there would be hell to pay. For the time being, though, the arrangement was pure heaven. For the first time in her life, she could enjoy spontaneous sex. She thought about what had happened recently in the cave and wondered if Donald had heard any of it. He pulled the hem of his orange sweatshirt down over his rounded hips. I just want to say for the record that I appreciate you two inviting me along on what was obviously intended as a private journey to find Bigfoot. Wouldn't have dreamed of intruding, except Roarke insisted. Donald has amazing equipment, Roarke said. Abby couldn't resist. So do you, dear. Roarke stared at her and actually blushed. Pardon us, Donald. Abby smiled up at Roarke, who was definitely giving her the evil eye. A little honeymoon humor. Oh, sure. Don't mind me. Roarke cleared his throat. Anyway, Donald, my brother's an expert in surveillance, but I think he could learn a thing or two from you. Donald preened. Have him give me a call. I'm always willing to share my techniques. Is your brother a Bigfoot aficionado as well? He dabbles, Roarke said. Ah. Donald rocked back on his heels. I'm well acquainted with the weekend Bigfoot hobbyist, but they're not like you and me, are they? No. Roarke gave Abby's shoulder a squeeze. We're hardcore. You and I are the kind of guys who will come up with the goods, get the confirming evidence, enlighten the unenlightened. After this we might get some talk show gigs, Roarke. I'm thinking Letterman. You know what? Abby stepped away from Roarke. I think I'll go grab the camp stove and some supplies so we can start the coffee. Roarke, would you like to help me with that? Sure thing, Abby. She marched back to the cave and shoved her way through the bush guarding the entrance. Instead of holding it for him, she let it snap back and was pretty sure he got a shower. He mumbled something, but she didn't try to figure out what it was. She waited until they were both able to stand before whirling to face him. Although she was fuming, she kept her voice low so Donald wouldn't hear. He's a total nutcase. What were you thinking, inviting him along? He has equipment. You should see the dish he has. It's small but extremely powerful. Battery operated. He's an engineer, so he very well could have built it himself. The guy's probably some sort of genius. I don't care if he's Albert Einstein. He's the kind of guy who will find Bigfoot and broadcast his findings to the world. Did you hear him? He wants to get on Letterman. I suppose he'd like to, but exactly. After what you've told me, that should be the last thing you want. For these fragile beings. I don't get this at all. Roarke glanced at the cave's entrance, as if to make sure Donald wasn't coming through to check on them. He'll never see Bigfoot. I'll make sure of that. How? You describe these amazing listening devices which he could be using. right this minute to hear what we're saying. You do realize that. Roarke pulled a wire out of his pocket. I asked him to show me how it works. And while I was examining it, I unhooked this. I'll put it back at some point. But I can always pretend I was fooling with it and didn't realize this was an important part. Don't worry. I'll make up whatever I need to in order to protect us. She wished he wasn't quite so good at doing that, but she'd deal with that issue later. Okay, so if we need his equipment to help us track Bigfoot and his mate, how can you utilize his equipment and keep him from seeing those creatures? You're going to help me. She stared at him. I assume that means you have a plan. I'm working on one. Trust me, Abby. Folding her arms, she looked down at the floor beneath their feet. I just listened to you come up with a lie to explain why we were honeymooners with no rings on our fingers. Then you show me the wire you filched from his listening device. You do these things so easily, and it made me wonder. She glanced up at him. Would you have created a similar story to make me think I would see Bigfoot too? Or worse yet, would you have lied about not needing to wear condoms to get the sex you wanted? He groaned. God no. Yes, I made up that story about the rings, and I certainly swiped a critical wire from Donald, but I'm not making up the things. I tell you. He sent her a pleading glance. What can I do to convince you of that? I don't know. When all is said and done, what do I really mean to you beyond a few rounds of good sex? You mean a lot more. That's what I was trying to say when I mentioned getting attached. But you won't allow yourself to do that, not really. You have your werewolf future, and I won't be part of that. You hold my future in the palm of your hand. Do I really, Roarke? Let's say I tried to convince people that I'd been hanging out with a werewolf and that werewolves were everywhere, especially in high society. Who would believe me? He gazed at her for a long time. I don't know, but it doesn't matter because you're not the type to do something like that and risk harming others. He had her pegged, all right. He was safe from her, but was she safe from him? As she looked into his green eyes, she wanted to believe that he shared that same reluctance to harm others. It's just that you can be so glib. I have a quick mind. I was born that way. But consider this, Abby. As a werewolf, I have to be constantly on the alert to protect myself and others of my kind from detection. In order to function in your world, yet maintain my other life, I need to be glib or risk exposure. She could see some truth in that. But can you choose when to lie and when not to? Or do lies jump to your mind automatically? I can choose. And with you, I choose to tell the truth. Once I forced your hand with those pictures, you had no choice. He inclined his head in acknowledgement of that. True. But as you now realize, the more you know, the greater your personal danger. If I could have lied my way out of that lunchtime confrontation with you, I would have to protect yourself. And to protect you. She regarded him silently for several seconds. Finally she sighed. I want to believe that. All right, Roarke. I will believe that. I've trusted you with my body, and there's no turning back on that score. My family's known for its fertility, so if you've misled me, we'll have a bouncing baby something in 9 months. That isn't going to happen. She didn't want a pregnancy either, and yet he just underscored the finite nature of their relationship. Someday he would have a child with another werewolf, and Abby would be a distant memory. She pretty much hated that. She drew a calming breath. Are you planning to allow me to see the Bigfoot pair? Yes. All right. She'd have to trust him on that too. Then what about this Donald character? Once we get close enough that I can cover the distance in about an hour as a wolf, we'll create a distraction that keeps Donald in camp with you. Like what? I don't know that yet. Be thinking about it. Okay? Despite herself, Abby began to get into the spirit of the game. I can do that. I know you can. You're very smart. So, with you distracting him, I'll make contact with the Bigfoot pair, and set up the procedure for relocation. Before returning to camp and shifting back. Then what? She noticed there was no provision for getting her to the Bigfoot camp or for spiriting Donald away from it. I don't know that yet either. I'm hoping it will come to me. But you will let me see those creatures, right? You have my word. We're in this together, Abby. She half expected him to pull her into his arms and try to convince her of his sincerity with a soulful kiss. When he didn't do that, she realized he wasn't trying to manipulate her into believing him. Okay, Roarke. I'll help you as much as I possibly can. Thank you. His response was low and quiet, and he didn't grace her with one of his oh-so-charming smiles. Maybe she could trust him after all. Either that or he was a lot slicker than she thought, and she already believed that he was a very, very clever werewolf. Well, that's that. She glanced around the cave. We'd better gather up the stuff for breakfast and head outside before Donald thinks we're in here. Boinking again. Now there's an idea. Hey. He backed away, palms extended. Just kidding. Believe it or not, I do think of other things now and then. She laughed. Then that would be one. Chapter 16. 3 hours later, as Roarke followed Donald and Abby through the forest, he could have cheerfully hoisted Donald up by his orange sweatsuit and left him dangling from the nearest tree branch. The guy hadn't stopped talking to Abby since they'd left camp. Apparently he was head of a product development team for Sony, and his endless stories of life at work gave the impression that the corporation would fold if Donald Smirts left. He might be wearing a primo listening device around his neck, but Roarke wondered how the guy could hear a thing through his earphones with all the noise coming out of his mouth. Roarke had never been tempted to shift into wolf form just to shut somebody up, but he was sorely tempted now. He wouldn't do it, but he amused himself by imagining the expression on Donald's round face if he turned and discovered a supersized wolf walking quietly behind him. That would be one sweet moment. Speaking of sweet moments, Roarke decided to pull out his handkerchief, ostensibly to mop his forehead. Pale sunlight filtered through the trees, but it wasn't nearly hot enough to work up a sweat, especially at the snail's pace Donald was setting. Still, Roarke could pretend he needed to wipe his weary brow. Ah yes, the musk of Abby's aroused body improved his mood considerably. He hated to put the handkerchief away again. Then he had an inspiration. It was a generously sized handkerchief, and by stretching the opposing corners and rolling it up he could create a sweatband. He just tied the ends behind his head when Donald raised his hand like a traffic cop, as if he was Dr. Freaking Livingstone on safari. This was the guy who deserved to have crackers dumped in his sleeping bag, but Roarke wouldn't do that either. With his sweatband on, he could be mellow. Halfway through a small meadow, Donald made a dramatic turn toward Abby and Roarke spoke in measured tones. My friends, the Sasquatch pair has changed course. They're coming in our direction. They're coming toward us? Abby spun around. Roarke, what do you? At that moment she must have noticed his sweatband, because her eyes widened. Then they crinkled at the corners and she slapped her hand over her mouth. She was laughing. Roarke deadpanned her, which only made her laugh harder. He pretended to ignore her and addressed Donald. That's excellent news, Donald. Can you calculate how fast they're moving? Not fast at all. But the sound of their progress was a steady tone as they moved in the same direction as we did. But now it's getting louder. Roarke took off his new sweatband with great reluctance and tucked it in his back pocket. He needed to focus on the Sasquatch scent, and he didn't want any olfactory distractions. Okay, now he could recognize that the faint scent was growing imperceptibly stronger. He didn't like admitting that Donald had been of any use when he was also a royal pain in the ass, but he had been the first one to notice that the Sasquatch pair had changed direction and were circling back. Now that Roarke agreed with Donald's assessment, it was time to put some plans into place. To prepare the way for those plans, Roarke would have to kiss some ass. He'd love for it to be Abby's literally, but sadly it would have to be Donald's metaphorically. I'm really impressed with the efficiency of your equipment, Donald, he said. If you don't have a patent on that thing, you should get one the minute you get back. Don't worry. Donald looked extremely pleased with himself. I wanted to field test it first, but this baby is going to make me a bundle. He smacked the listening device vigorously and then winced and took out the earbuds. Forgot it was on. Powerful little thing. Indeed. Roarke fought to keep a straight face. Donald was a real piece of work. I'd say it's just saved us a whole lot of hiking. Don't you think we should just keep going? Unless they stop, we might sight them before dark. But we don't know what the terrain will be when that happens. Here we have a nice open meadow. Donald nodded approvingly. Good thinking, Wallace. So we set ourselves up to wait with our cameras ready so we're not taken by surprise. I knew you'd be a valuable asset to this operation. Thanks. I also have to admit I'd like a break from hiking. You're probably still fresh, but oh yeah, I could go all day. Well, I can't, and I'll bet Abby would like to rest too. I'd be very grateful, Abby said right on cue. I haven't wanted to say anything, but I scraped my thigh on a jagged branch back there and I'm afraid to look at it. It feels as if blood's dribbling all the way down my leg. Oh. Roarke's stomach twisted as he hurried toward her. You should have said something, Abby. Let me take a look. Donald turned pale. I'll step away if you don't mind. I'm not so good with blood. Thanks, Donald, Abby said. You'll help preserve my modesty that way, too. Because I'll have to pull my pants down to show Roarke. Something in her tone, something that was almost a giggle, clued him in that she might be faking. God, he hoped so. He'd asked her to start thinking, and maybe this was what she'd come up with. The thought of her bleeding profusely was simply not acceptable. Donald wandered up the trail. You guys let me know when you're finished. There. Sorry about being so squeamish, but I've been like that all my life. Roarke knelt in front of Abby and reached for the waistband of her lycra pants. Are you really hurt? He asked in a low voice. She leaned down. No. He sighed in relief as he worked her pants down. Good. Sorry if I worried you, but I wanted your reaction to look authentic. Believe me, it was authentic. The thought that you'd ripped open this soft skin. He caressed the inside of her right thigh and shuddered. She shuddered, too, which stroked his male ego. No funny business, Roarke. Not even a little funny business? Not now. Maybe later. Here's what I came up with. I have a bad gash. You'll bind it with gauze and keep checking on it the rest of the day. He pulled her pants down to her knees. I like that part. God, you smell good. Which leg? I don't care. You're right then. He raised his voice. Damn, Abby, you should have said something. You're a mess. Taking off his pack, he located his first aid kit and took out the roll of gauze. She leaned closer. Whenever you're ready to intercept the Sasquatch pair, you'll check my bandage and decide my wound's infected and you're leaving Donald in charge while you head back to civilization and pick up some antibiotics. But nobody would prescribe. Just say you have a doctor friend who will. And I have ibuprofen gel caps. That should look close enough. Abby Winchell, you're brilliant. Thank you. Now spread your legs a little. Roarke, I told you not to. As much as I'd love to fool around with your warm and sexy body, I agree that now is not the time. I just need room to wind this gauze around your thigh. Do you want it closer to your crotch or your knee? Closer to my crotch. He glanced up to find her grinning at him. Somehow I knew you'd say that. You love to torture me, don't you? Who says you're not torturing me? I sincerely hope so. He breathed in her special aroma as he wound the gauze around her thigh about 2 inches from the entrance to All Things Wonderful. I'm going to recommend you rest in your tent for the rest of the day. What if I get lonely? I'll check on you often. His groin tightened at the prospect of all the times he'd have to play doctor with her today. I think you like my plan. I'm crazy about your plan. He reached up and pinched her butt. Ouch. I'm so sorry, Abby. He called out loud enough for Donald to hear. I didn't mean to hurt you, but it's a really deep cut. Smart Alec, she murmured. You could have warned me you were going to do that. I wanted it to be authentic. And I suppose you just had to pinch me there. I've wanted to do that again ever since last night. It's one of my favorite parts of you. He finished winding the gauze and tied it off. I suppose we didn't even have to do this part. He'll never see your bandage. I never told you to actually bandage me, now did I? He looked up and saw the mischief dancing in her blue eyes. Then why did you? Go ahead and let me do it. Why do you think, big boy? He caressed the silky skin of her thigh. To get me hot, I suppose. And me. He ran a knuckle over the crotch of her panties. They were deliciously damp. He stifled a groan. Time to pitch your tent, little lady. Thank you for tending to me, Dr. Wallace. He pulled her pants up and stood. Oh, I'll be tending to you a lot more. You're going to need some serious tending. He raised his voice. All done. Donald, I'm going to help Abby to that rock over there and let her sit down while I pitch her tent. She needs to get off that leg. Donald walked back in their direction. Pretty bad, huh? Nasty gash. Roarke hooked a shoulder under Abby's right armpit. If you have a queasy stomach, you don't want to look at it. Other side, she muttered. Huh. She rolled her eyes. It's the right leg, so you want to support me on the left side so I can hop on my left leg. Oh, right. No left. He blew out a breath. That's what I meant. I can already tell you're going to be a difficult patient. I think she's a trooper, Donald said. Don't worry about a thing, Abby. Roarke and I will handle this situation. Thank you, Donald. I feel like the weak link. Nah, Donald said. One thing about all this. Neither of you will forget this. Honeymoon. I'm sure you're right. Roarke eased Abby down onto the rock. He'd never given much thought to his actual honeymoon, where he'd like to go or who he'd be spending it with. Up to now, he hadn't been able to picture anyone in that role. He didn't have that problem anymore. Instead, he had a different one. He couldn't picture going on a honeymoon with anyone but Abby. Abby lay in her small tent and listened to raindrops patter on the teal-colored nylon while the guys fixed lunch. According to Roarke, Donald's tent had a front flap that could be propped up to provide shelter for things like making food. Roarke had promised to make sure Donald's tent was set up a good distance from hers in the hope that Roarke and Abby could enjoy some alone time later. She still wasn't sure how Roarke planned to get her to see the Sasquatch pair and keep Donald away, but she'd handed him the first part of the plan and it seemed as if it would work. Her plan had come to her while listening to Donald's monologue this morning. Although he was the hero in nearly every story he'd told her, he'd mentioned an incident in which he'd cut himself on a sharp staple and his beautiful secretary had rushed to his aid with ointment, a bandage and plenty of sympathy. His hands, it seemed, were critical to his team at Sony. On a hunch, Abby had asked whether there had been any blood involved in this industrial accident of mammoth proportions. That's when she'd learned that Donald had a serious phobia. Abby, ready for some soup? Bring it on, Professor. She sat up and scooted back in the tent to give him room. They hadn't tried sharing this space yet, and she was curious about how they'd maneuver. He was very large. He unzipped the flap and crouched down with a tin cup in each hand. Minestrone. Sounds great. It will be if I can get it in there without dumping it all over both of us. Well, we can't eat outside in the rain. Let me help. Donald wouldn't be able to see through the opaque material of the tent, so she gave up the pretense of her injury and crawled toward the entrance. Give me one of the cups. He handed it to her, and she crawled backwards and set the cup on a bare spot on the tent floor. Careful not to kick it, she crawled back. Now the other one. She repeated the process so that both cups were together on the floor. Then she carefully took a cross-legged position and hoped she'd left enough room for Roarke. This is one small tent. He got on all fours, pulled off his hiking boots, and tucked them just inside the entrance before coming in. Closing the short distance to Abby, he kissed her full on the mouth. She wouldn't exactly say she'd been bored lying alone in the tent, but that kiss made life a whole lot more interesting. Cupping his head, she delved into his mouth with her tongue and made a happy little sound low in her throat. He drew back with obvious reluctance. You need to make that sound more like a moan of pain than a moan of ecstasy, he murmured softly. At least until he starts in with his harmonica. She kept her voice low. Is that likely to happen soon? I never thought I'd say this, but I hope so. I told him that playing the harmonica would be a good idea so the Sasquatch couple would be drawn to this very spot. Smart man. The problem is, he likes his food and I don't think he'll start playing until after lunch. So maybe, all things considered, we should have our soup before I... He paused to waggle his eyebrows at her. Take off your bandage. Do you think you can sit down? Sort of. He maneuvered into the spot she'd left for him and copied her cross-legged position, except he had to hunch over or his head would have made a dent in the roof. Whose idea was it to bring these tiny tents anyway? Yours and Grandpa Earl's, if I remember correctly. I wasn't involved and I came out to discover you'd both agreed these would be marvelous. She handed him one of the cups. Yeah, well, they're not. And explaining the separate tent thing to Donald was quite a challenge. I didn't hear that part. Abby picked up her cup and took a sip. What did you say? I told him that when we got married, you were a virgin. Abby choked on her soup. Sorry. Reaching over, he rubbed her back until she could breathe again. I should have led up to that. No, really? What makes you think so? She glared at him but kept her voice lowered. That was the best you could do? A virgin. He shrugged. I had to think fast because he was obviously confused when he saw that we had 2 separate tents. I told him that you were so shy at first, that you didn't want me to see you dress and undress, so you wanted your own tent for that. If he heard us in the cave this morning, I'm sure he knows I've recovered from that problem. Oh yeah, he knows. I told him that after a couple of nights with me you'd turned into a wild woman. You didn't. Sure. He placed a hand over her mouth. No, I didn't. I can't seem to resist teasing you, probably because I'm getting horny as hell and we can't do anything about it until he starts playing his damned harmonica. So what did you say about me? That with some gentle persuasion, you'd emerged from your virginal shell and were starting to enjoy the benefits of marriage, to a stud. She whacked him on the arm. You're incorrigible. I told you. I get like this when I'm sexually frustrated. So think about something else. Tell me how you see the rest of this playing out. Unless you think he has his listening device pointed this way. Nope. It's permanently set up pointing at the Bigfoot pair lumbering in our direction. Her pulse rate spiked. That's pretty exciting, Roarke. Aren't you excited? Not about that. Why not? I've dealt with these creatures before, so it's not quite the thrill for me that it is for you. Besides, they really do stink. That part won't be any fun at all. So how will this work exactly? I've been thinking about it, and here's my idea. He lowered his voice and leaned closer. You lie down close to the edge of the tent, and if I lie on my side I should be able to. The Bigfoot plan, you sex maniac. Oh, I assumed you meant how we could enjoy some nookie. She couldn't help laughing, but she muffled it because she was supposed to be in pain. You assumed wrong. He sighed. Too bad. All right, I've been thinking about the other plan too. That's reassuring. Do you want to hear this, or shall I just start kissing you again? I do. She gestured for him to continue. Please. Okay, once I make contact, I'll figure out a place the Bigfoot pair can hide. For a day or so. Cave would be perfect. I'll tell them they have to be absolutely quiet so they won't show up on Donald's surveillance equipment. I'll set a time when the helicopter will pick them up. What about me seeing them? He rubbed her knee. Take it easy. I'm getting to that. We'll figure out a way for you to watch them board the helicopter. And what about Donald? I'm thinking some sort of misdirection. The Sasquatch will have gone silent. So when I come back with some fake antibiotics for you, I can bring news of sightings in a different part of the forest. If this trail has gone dead, I think he'd go. We absolutely can't let him near those creatures, Roarke. For all his brains, he's incredibly insecure. He would use them shamelessly if he thought he could make a splash in the media and get his 15 seconds of fame. I know. Don't worry. I'll protect them from him this time. But he's developed that equipment specifically so he can locate them. He's a menace. Roarke frowned. You're right. Maybe I need to arrange for a good scare while he's out here, so he'll give up on this idea completely. I'd be in favor of that. Something involving blood should work. Right. Draining the last of his soup, Roarke set down his cup. And speaking of squeamish Donald, I sure would appreciate him playing us a little tune. Are you sure about this idea? Even if he can't hear anything, I'm afraid we'll look like a couple of cats in a bag. You just have no faith in me at all, do you? Yes, I do, but there's a slight breeze blowing, so I suggested that he face his tent away from it so he can sit in the doorway under the flap to play without getting wet from the rain. Turns out the breeze was very cooperative, and now the front of his tent faces in such a way that he can't even see yours. She gazed at him admiringly. I'm impressed. You ain't seen nothing yet. Hark, is that the sound of Oh Susanna? I hear. The notes piercing the air threatened to pierce Abby's eardrums as well. You weren't kidding. He's terrible. Actually, I'm becoming quite fond of his playing. I can't speak for Mrs. Bigfoot, but that harmonica is certainly sending my hormones into overdrive. Abby laughed. They were already there. True. He held out his hand. Give me your cup. She handed it to him, and he put both cups outside the tent and zipped it closed. And now, my poor injured bride, I need you to take off your pants. Both pairs. Do you now? Absolutely. I'm a doctor. Not that kind of doctor. Hey, we're out in the wilderness, and you obviously need a doctor. Are you going to be choosy? She had no idea how they were going to engineer a sexual experience, but with lust raging through her body, she was more than willing to try. Yes. And I choose you. Chapter 18. Roarke didn't have any trouble sounding worried when he hurried over to where Donald sat just inside his tent eating his stew, leaving Abby to the care of. This doofus, even if she wasn't actually injured, went against Roarke's every instinct. But he had no choice if he expected to solve the Bigfoot problem. Bad news, Donald. He held the 2 cups of stew, the one Abby had eaten and the one he hadn't touched. Her wound's infected and she's running a fever. He held up the full cup of stew. She couldn't eat. Behind his thick lenses, Donald's eyes looked huge. Good God. What are we going to do? The Sasquatch could be here by morning. They could, but they'll probably stop for the night, so it could be midday before they arrive. Roarke was counting on the pair stopping to rest. I hope to be back before they get here. Donald's eyes got even bigger and he scrambled to his feet, spilling some stew on his orange sweatshirt. You're leaving. I want you to stay with Abby while I head back to get some antibiotics for her. No reputable doctor will give you a prescription without seeing her. Roarke mentally thanked Abby for giving him the answer to that one. I have a friend who will, once I describe the situation. Look, I'll travel as fast as I can. Believe me, adrenaline is pumping through my system and I'll make good progress. Yes, but I hope to get back here before the Sasquatch pair arrives, but in case I don't, I'll feel good knowing you're here, getting the evidence and watching over Abby. But what should I do about her? Does she need me to sponge her down? No. Donald shrank back in alarm. Roarke toned down his response. I mean, she would hate that, being so modest and all. Well, yeah, but if she has a fever, I've always heard you're supposed to sponge people down. Roarke hated that idea on so many levels. You might cause her to start bleeding again if you did that. Oh. Donald paled. Well then, better not chance it. She's not going to die, so don't panic. But I can't expect her to hike back out of here when she has a fever and she needs something to counteract that infection. No, of course she can't hike out when she's like this. Once she has the antibiotics, she'll start to recover. But I need to get them for her now. Right. It's just that I thought you'd be here when Samson and Delilah showed up. Who? The Sasquatch pair. They don't have names. Donald brightened. They do now. I named them today while you were taking care of Abby. It'll play better with the media if we give them each a name. Like everyone uses Nessie for the Loch Ness Monster. Personalizes the creatures, you know. It would be good if you started referring to them that way too. Roarke started to deny that he'd ever referred to the Sasquatch pair by the names Samson and Delilah, but decided not to waste his breath. It wouldn't matter, because Donald would never make contact with them. We should name the baby too. Roarke patted Donald on the shoulder. You think about that while I'm gone. Now if you'll excuse me, I'll throw a few things into my pack and be off. He turned toward his tent. I sure wish we got cell reception out here, Donald called after him. But we don't, Roarke said over his shoulder, and now he was thrilled about that. I'm afraid hiking back is my only option. He made a dash for his tent. Before Donald could hold him up any longer, the Sasquatch odor grew stronger with every passing minute. Fortunately, the rain seemed to be letting up, which would make the forest floor a little less slippery as he loped along. Anticipating this change into wolf form, he brought a plastic bag for his backpack and his clothes. He stuffed that in the empty pack along with Abby's ibuprofen. He decided to leave his watch in the tent. Donald wouldn't notice he wasn't wearing it, and it was one less thing to leave out in the forest after he shifted. As a human, he would have needed to take more on this trip. As a wolf, he needed nothing, but he had to leave camp as if he were a man going for a long hike, so he tucked some other clothes in the pack. In the process, he came across the handkerchief he'd made into a headband. He allowed himself one long inhale before shoving that into his pack too. He was ready. Ducking out of the tent, he zipped it closed and stood. See you, Donald. Donald stood watching him, anxiety etched on his round face. Hurry. Don't worry, I will. Then he walked quickly over to Abby's tent. Bye, Abby, he said softly. Bye, Roarke. She sounded a little bit nasal, as if she'd been crying. It'll be okay. I know. Shit, she had been crying. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about that. Anything he said would only make it worse. Bye, he said again and walked away before he could hear her response. In order to fool Donald, He had to walk back the way they'd come, at least, until he had enough cover. As the light faded from the sky, he plowed quickly through the trees and underbrush, following the trampled leaves and broken branches from their passage through here earlier. He walked nearly a mile before he considered it safe to strip down. As he took off his clothes and stuffed everything in the plastic bag he brought, he thought of Abby's pictures and wondered what she planned to do with them. She cared about him the way he cared about her. She'd destroy the flash drive and the prints when she returned to her grandfather's place. She was in control of that decision, because she hadn't told him where she'd hidden the flash drive, only that her grandfather would look there if for some reason she turned up missing. But she wouldn't turn up missing. She'd be fine in camp until he could go back for her. Telling himself that and believing it were two different things. As he lay on the cold ground and willed his shift, he realized that being separated from Abby was a condition he didn't care for at all. It felt unnatural, as if he'd left part of himself back at camp. But he wouldn't want her here either, to witness his transformation into a wolf. She might have pictures of it, but that was one step removed. Aiden claimed that Emma was used to seeing her husband shift, but Roarke questioned that. He still believed in the separation of humans and werewolves. It defied the natural order to throw them together. What a cruel joke that fate had placed Abby in his path. As he rose from the ground and shook himself from head to tail, he glanced down at his large forepaws. A few hours ago they'd been human hands capable of caressing Abby. How could he expect her to accept that he could become this? He couldn't. Nudging the plastic bag under a bush with his nose, he turned, caught the scene of the Sasquatch, and headed back the way he'd come. When he sighted the camp through the trees, he paused, head up. A light was on in Abby's tent, and damn it to hell, that traffic cone of a man was sitting in front of the open flap, probably droning on about his accomplishments at Sony. Roarke fought the urge to charge in, take him by the throat, and shake him like a rag doll. But that would be stupid. Although Donald wouldn't know the wolf shaking him was Roarke, he'd certainly tell everyone who would listen about his life-threatening encounter with the giant beast, and words didn't need stories like that floating around. Skirting the camp, Roarke picked up the pace. He had a job to do. Abby pretended to fall asleep during Donald's description of a conference he'd attended as, of course, a featured speaker. Donald didn't seem to care whether she was conscious or not. Abby wondered if he talked to the wall at home. She couldn't imagine Donald not talking. For all she knew, he held some sort of world record. So then, you'll never guess who came up to me after my speech, Donald said. Abby faked a soft snore. The Terminator himself. Arnie. I pointed a finger at him and said in his accent, "Hasta la vista, baby," and he just cracked up. He said I should have been an actor, which I thought about back in college, but Donald paused. Did you hear something? Abby's eyes snapped open. She couldn't possibly have heard something with Donald droning on, but now that he'd stopped, she did hear a rustling noise. Were those footsteps? Propping herself on her elbows, she raised up so she could see Donald. She'd no sooner done that than he scrambled into the tent with her and zipped the flap. Like that would protect him. Outside, a stick cracked as if someone or something had stepped on it. All the possibilities ran through Abby's head. Bigfoot had given Roarke the slip. The bear had smelled their food and wanted some. A herd of deer had shown up now. That the werewolf had left the area. Or it could be a human, although why a human wouldn't call out a greeting made her think whatever was out there wasn't human. She eased to a sitting position. She wasn't quite ready to give Donald the information that she wasn't hurt after all. But if push came to shove, she'd rather use her legs than be trampled or eaten or whatever else might happen to her if she kept up the charade of being a maiden in distress. Donald was shaking and his face had lost all color. It can't be Samson and Delilah, he murmured. I checked the equipment an hour ago and their position was static. They've stopped for the night. Maybe they changed their plans. Donald had informed her earlier about his decision to name the Sasquatch pair, so she knew who he was talking about. But she was inclined to believe that it wasn't them. For one thing, she couldn't smell them, and both Roarke and Grandpa Earl had assured her she would gag once she did. Could be a herd of deer, she said. Donald stared at her, hope struggling with terror in his eyes. You think Bigfoot would smell? Oh my God, you're right. His shoulders sagged in relief, but then they hunched up again. Could be a grizz. Abby smiled and shook her head. Not around here. Could be a bear though. I'll grant you that. He began to shake again and his teeth chattered. Which means we're supposed to curl up and play dead, right? Abby felt sorry for the poor guy. Why did you come out here by yourself if you're so afraid? My sister double dared me. Oh. She made sure not to let a hint of a smile cross her lips. I researched the area and bear sightings are rare. That's true. And now Abby had a good idea why. With a pack of werewolves living on the Gentry estate, bears would tend to go elsewhere rather than fight for territory. She had seen deer over the years, but they were used to sensing predators nearby, and the foliage was lush and plentiful enough to keep them hanging around, werewolves or no werewolves. I thought if I could get a picture of Bigfoot, I could stick it to all those people who think I'm some kind of nut, including my older sister, Donald said. Abby was tempted to ask him if he worked for Sony at all or if he was a technician in a second-rate repair facility, but she didn't want to kick a guy when he was down. Roarke was convinced Donald was really smart, but his lack of social skills might have caused him to be underemployed. Another branch cracked. Whatever was out there hadn't gone away. I'll bet it's deer, Abby said, more to calm her own jumpy pulse than to reassure Donald. She'd never camped overnight alone. She'd always had her brother along. I hope you're right. Deer are cool. Abby decided to give him a chance to be manly. Do you want to go out there and make sure? Oh, I think we should leave them alone to do their thing. No use scaring them, right? I guess you have a point, Donald. He was beginning to grow on her. Or maybe it was any port in a storm. Think about it, Abby. If I walked out there, they might think I was some big bad hunter ready to fire away. I saw Bambi as a kid. I can relate. Okay then. Abby had to say this for the experience. It was a lot more exciting than listening to Donald bragging about his life as an engineer. She was beginning to suspect most, if not all, of the things he'd told her weren't true. But all guys couldn't be like Roarke, who had the muscles, the looks, the courage, the brains, the fur. Something sent a rock skittering along the ground very close to the tent and Donald flinched. They wouldn't stampede or anything, would they? I've never heard of deer stampeding through a camp. You might be thinking of a cattle drive or maybe even wild buffalo back in the Old West. You're right. His shoulders sagged again. You know how it is in the dark when your imagination runs away with you there in the tent. Abby's wide gaze met Donald's and she couldn't have said who was more scared. She couldn't speak for him, but she almost peed her pants. Even so, she must have found some courage somewhere because she piped up immediately with, "Who's there?" No answer. Her skin prickled. I said, "Who's there?" Apparently they weren't going to play her game of knock knock because no one bothered to answer her question. Drug dealers, Donald whispered. She shook her head. They wouldn't want anything to do with us. She lifted her eyebrows. Would they? He gulped. I have some grass in my backpack. Just so you don't have any crystal meth, I think we're okay. God no, but still they might think that. Come out of the tent, said a voice cold as the waters of the Columbia. We don't want to have to wait for you. Then light poured through the nylon tent from what had to be several battery-operated lanterns. If this had been a movie, Roarke would have arrived just at that moment to save the day and put the intruders, whoever they were, in their place. But Abby didn't think Roarke would show up just now, and she had a very bad feeling about who was outside the tent. Donald could barely speak, but he leaned toward her. Do you think it's banditos here to rob, rape, and pillage? No, she would have preferred bandits. At least they had a profit motive. Donald cleared his throat and clenched his fists. We have an injured woman in here. His voice quivered as he said it, but at least he'd tried. Thanks, Donald, she said softly. Don't be a hero. I'll be okay. No, you stay here. They might have guns. He looked as if he might pass out. Any minute. I'll see what they want. Maybe you should let me go first. Nope. Resolution gleamed in his gray eyes. Wallace told me to watch out for you, and I will. He lifted his round chin as if he figured he was about to meet his death. Semper Fi. You were a Marine? She regretted the disbelief in her voice, but if Donald was a former Marine, she was a former Miss Universe. No, my sister was. With that he zipped open the flap and crawled out into the glare from the lanterns. She couldn't let him do that alone. Crawling out after him, she blinked in the bright light. Then she stood and faced. Damn it all, Cameron Gentry, king of the Portland Werewolf. Chapter 19. All Roarke had to do at this point was follow his nose. Why anyone would want to track down Bigfoot was beyond him. The creature might be sweet and exotic, but an open sewer couldn't rival the stench. When he was about 2 miles from the pair, he started looking for another cave. The one he and Abby had so thoroughly enjoyed wouldn't have been big enough, so he was hoping for something a little larger. There, a shadow in the side of the hill. Bingo! A family of coyotes had taken up residence, but he convinced them to vacate. For the next couple of days, he didn't tell them they'd have to fumigate when they returned, but if they were this close to the Sasquatch pair already, they couldn't be all that particular. A half-mile away from the Sasquatch, Roarke buried his nose in some wild mint for a few seconds just so he could go on without barfing. He doubted any creatures had remained this close to the encampment. Roarke hated to move the Sasquatch somewhere else because he'd only be transferring the noxious odor to another part of the pristine forest. But the creatures had to live somewhere, and they were part of biodiversity, so Roarke was committed to the relocation plan. Finally he could see their camp, such as it was. Sasquatch weren't known for their domestic skills. A pile of mangled roots and berries lay in the small clearing, and the mated pair lay sprawled against each other near the pile of what was essentially garbage. Although the common wisdom pegged Sasquatch as omnivores, Roarke had never known them to eat meat. But he'd never figured out why, if they were herbivores, they smelled so bad. Maybe they simply had bad digestion, which might be an inherited trait. A creature that large could give off some serious gas, especially when they were asleep after a meal. Jesus. Roarke wondered if he'd be asphyxiated before he completed his mission. But he took a moment to recognize that cryptozoologists the world over would sacrifice their retirement account to be where he was right this minute, gazing at two mythical creatures seldom seen by the human eye. They weren't being seen by the human eye now either. They were being seen by the werewolf eye. But he hoped to lay this spectacle at Abby's feet, and maybe at Earl's as well. That possibility helped him deal with the fetid odor of a Sasquatch camp. The light was dim, so he couldn't make out the color of their shaggy coats. The scientist in him wondered where they fit along the known spectrum of dark brown to red, but clouds obscured the moonlight that might have revealed that. Padding silently toward the sleeping pair, he lifted his head and howled, the werewolf version of an alarm clock. They woke up slowly, groggily, as if some of the berries they'd consumed had been fermented. Roarke hoped not, because that wouldn't be good for the little one carried in the female's rounded belly. The male stood, all 9 feet of him, and towered over Roarke. But he was flabby and Roarke was solid muscle. Besides, Sasquatch and Werewolves had never fought over anything. The huge creatures seemed to recognize a superior intelligence and deferred to it. Roarke sent the telepathic message he'd mentally constructed as he traveled here. Through images he hoped they would understand, he told them they were not safe here and needed to find another place to have the baby. There was no response at first. Roarke expected that. The Sasquatch were slow thinkers and needed time to assimilate new facts. The male's protruding brow wrinkled as he struggled with the proposition. At last the answer came, and it was as he'd expected. The female had been born near here, and she wanted her baby to be born here too. Roarke understood that urge. His kind were territorial in that way too, but he projected the image of werewolves and let the pair know they'd invaded were territory. The female rose and shuffled over to join her mate. She stared at him stubbornly, defiantly. Obviously she didn't want to go elsewhere, despite the worst. Roarke looked into her dark eyes and absorbed the rest of her message. She was too far along to go a great distance. Roarke wondered if he'd be able to pull this off after all. He'd never coaxed a mated pair into a helicopter before, and he didn't know if they'd understand the concept. He mentally projected climbing aboard a helicopter, lifting off, and then landing somewhere safe. If he hadn't been about to gag from the stench, he would have found the scene pretty funny. They turned to each other, their brows wrinkled in an obvious effort to figure out the whole flying concept. Then they literally put their heads together and muttered in a language Roarke hadn't yet studied. Telepathy was much more efficient. Finally the male turned and puffed out his chest. Then he shook his head and put a protective arm around his mate. Roarke admired the male's protective stance. If Roarke were in their shoes, he Wouldn't trust his mate to some unknown mechanical bird either. But they had to go. He decided to try a different approach. He projected an image of humans, tracking them down. For good measure, he threw in a scene of them being captured and hauled away. The male glanced around the clearing as if expecting hunters to rush out of the trees. When nothing happened, he turned back to the female and they muttered some more. Apparently she held equal power in the relationship, and Roarke took note of that so he could add it to the accumulated knowledge about the creatures. He would have to remember to tell Abby about that. In fact, he needed to remember every detail of this interaction so that he could relate it to her. He imagined how her blue eyes would shine with wonder and all the questions she'd ask. Once again the male faced Roarke, but he seemed more open, more willing. He wanted to know more about the helicopter. Roarke did his best. He projected images of safety but added that there would be noise and wind from the whirling blades. He didn't want them to be unprepared and turn tail at the last minute. They seemed to be concentrating very hard as they tried to understand. So much depended on that moment when the Sasquatch were expected to climb into a machine that would take them up in the air, something they'd never experienced. They would be terrified. Roarke became so involved in his task that he almost forgot that he was in sensory hell. These creatures might not be particularly intelligent, but they were kind and respectful to each other, and that counted for a lot with Roarke. Finally he realized what had to happen. He'd meet them at the cave in wolf form, escort them to the waiting helicopter, and ride with them on the way to their new home. He'd show them with his calm demeanor that there was nothing to be afraid of. That meant Earl wouldn't be able to watch the departure, but Abby still could. Facing the Sasquatch pair, Roarke communicated the plan and they both brightened considerably. They conferred once more in their muttered language before facing Roarke again. Interestingly, the female was the one who transmitted their thoughts. Apparently because she was the one having the baby, she had the final say. They would go on the helicopter. Abby would love hearing that the female had the authority. He could hardly wait to tell her. In the back of his mind lurked the thought that soon he wouldn't have the luxury of being able to tell Abby things unless he wanted to keep in touch on the internet. Yeah, right. They could be Facebook buddies. Not. There was no way in hell he'd be willing to maintain some anemic online contact with a woman with whom he'd shared copious orgasms. It was all or nothing. But he couldn't think about that now. He had to focus on finishing this task. Coaxing the pair to follow him to the cave he'd picked out was much easier than convincing them to fly in a helicopter. He suggested they gather food along the way, enough to get them through a couple of days until he could come for them. They left quite a trail of destruction on the way to the cave, ripping up entire bushes until both of them had more than they could carry. After multiple relays, they seemed to think they had enough food to last for the duration. After extracting their promise that they would not leave the cave until Roarke showed up, he started back. He moved quickly, eager to tell Abby that he'd set up the relocation plan. Abby had seen Cameron Gentry twice in her life, both times in downtown Portland. The first time she'd been about 6 and had gone into town with her brother Pete and her grandparents for an ice cream sundae. Cameron, teenager, had been in the same ice cream parlor with his parents. Abby distinctly remembered he treated the waitress like dirt. The second time she'd encountered Cameron had been about 15 years later, on a crowded sidewalk when he'd hurried past with some business associates. In his complete self-absorption, he'd nearly knocked her grandmother down and then hadn't bothered to apologize. Grandpa Earl had wanted to challenge him, but Grandma Olive had talked him out of it. Abby doubted Cameron would remember her from either incident. As she studied him now, she decided he hadn't aged well. The touches of gray at his temples should have made him look distinguished, but the lines of cruelty around his mouth eliminated any attractiveness he might have. As for his attitude of entitlement, that hadn't improved one damned bit. He obviously still thought the world was his oyster, but he didn't have the brawn to back up that belief, so he brought along 3 burly guys on this mission. Abby was willing to bet all 4 men could shift into wolves at a moment's notice. Good thing Donald didn't know that. The poor man acted pathetically grateful to discover their visitors seemed normal and weren't carrying weapons. What Donald didn't know couldn't hurt him. What Abby knew could hurt her, though, so she'd play dumb for as long as she could get away with it. Once Donald had verified that he wasn't in danger of being shot, He'd started to babble. You guys gave us quite a scare. I bet you're with the forest service or something, huh? Want some coffee? I could make some on the camp stove in no time flat. I have cookies too. Oreos. They pack better than. Where's Wallace? Cameron looked directly at Abby. She shouldn't have been surprised that they'd immediately know Roarke had been here. They were werewolves, so they could probably stick their sensitive noses in Roarke's vacant tent and smell that he'd left a few hours ago. Still, she did her best imitation of a clueless female. Wallace who? He means Roarke, Abby, Donald said helpfully. You should probably go back in the tent and let me handle this. He glanced at Cameron. She's not herself, which is understandable considering that this is her honeymoon and her groom is off getting antibiotics for her infection. Cameron stared at Donald as if trying to decide whether he was crazy or just stupid. What the hell are you talking about? Donald laughed nervously. I know it seems weird that Roarke and Abby would invite me to team up with them on their honeymoon hike, but we found out we have a lot of things in common, so we… Shut up, whoever you are. Cameron turned back to Abby. I sincerely doubt that Wallace got married in the last 2 days, let alone to Earl Dooley's granddaughter. Donald gasped. You're his granddaughter? What a coincidence. He's the one who sighted the mated Bigfoot pair. Abby felt sick to her stomach as she looked at Cameron. Dear God, if Cameron had done anything to Grandpa Earl, but Roarke had said he was safe because he didn't know about the wars. She'd hang on to that thought. She took a deep breath. How did you find out I'm Earl's granddaughter? Wallace had suddenly become very sympathetic to Earl's situation, and he was acting odd before he left on this hike, so on a hunch I went over to Earl's store this afternoon. He proudly, and somewhat defiantly I might add, told me you and Wallace had set out together and you were going to bring back evidence that Bigfoot exists. Donald stared at her. So are you two married or what? I told you to shut up. Cameron motioned angrily to one of the 3 guys standing behind him. See that he doesn't bother me again. Donald gasped as 2 of the men started toward him. Abby stepped in front of him. Don't either of you dare lay a hand on this man. If you do, I'll have you arrested for assault. One of the men picked her up by the waist as if she were a piece of furniture in his way and set her to one side. As she spun around with a cry of protest, they each grabbed one of Donald's arms and propelled him backwards out of the circle of light. Donald's mouth rounded in terror, but nothing came out. Abby started toward him, but the 3rd man closed his large hand around her bicep and held her in place. She considered kicking him in the crotch, but she wasn't sure that would be wise, all things considered. If this incident turned physical, she and Donald wouldn't stand a chance against a quartet of Werewolves. All right, Abby Winchell, Cameron said, his voice deceptively soft. We're not going to play games. What are you to Roarke Wallace? Now there was $1 million question. Nothing, she said. My grandfather wanted to go with him on his search for Bigfoot, but he's not physically up to it, so I volunteered to go instead. Cameron sighed. Wallace wasn't on a sightseeing trip and he would have had no logical reason to take you along. He gave Abby the once-over. Well, I can see one possible reason. She flushed. But if Cameron wanted to think that Roarke had brought her along to warm his sleeping bag at night, then she'd let him think that. But Cameron shook his head. Doesn't make logical sense. He might want you, but not on this trip where all you do is slow him down. He would have accomplished his mission first and had fun with you later. That wasn't possible. I'm leaving town. He had to take advantage of the time I'd be here. Sorry, that won't wash. Wallace is resourceful when it comes to the ladies. He would have followed you to Phoenix for some R&R if that's what he was really after. She hated that Cameron obviously had checked up on her before coming out here to find her. He probably knew everything about her entire family. Maybe he'd always known everything in case it would help him in his quest to get the Dooley property. I'm going to assume that Wallace is off doing the business I asked him to do. But that still doesn't explain you. Maybe Roarke isn't as dedicated to efficiency as you think, she said. Maybe he wasn't willing to wait until he could meet me in Phoenix. Maybe, but I still can't see him dragging you along on this trip or hooking up with the geek over there either. It doesn't add up. Abby shrugged as if she didn't care what Cameron thought, but her mind was going a mile a minute. If they'd talked to Grandpa Earl this afternoon, they'd arrived at this campsite damn fast. The reason for that chilled her. They'd made the trip as worse, moving swiftly down the trail like bloodhounds. Yet, what about clothes once they arrived? Each of them wore a small backpack, and then she figured it out. They'd shifted before they'd left, and then someone at the mansion had strapped the packs on their backs. In shifting back to human form, they'd simply slipped out of the packs and dressed in the clothes tucked inside. Knowing how quickly they could traverse the forest as worse, she understood just how much of a handicap she'd given Roarke by tagging along. No wonder Cameron couldn't believe that Roarke had taken her willingly. She caught the were studying her and looked away. She didn't want anything in her expression to tip him off about what she knew. Cameron tapped a finger against his chin. Something's missing from the equation, and I'll bet you could tell me what it is, Abby Winchell. I have no idea what you're talking about. I think you do, but maybe we need to continue this discussion somewhere else. She couldn't imagine what he had in mind, but then she heard the womp 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 of rotary blades. There was a helicopter in the area, and she didn't have to guess who owned it. Roarke had said the Sasquatch pair would be airlifted out, so of course the Gentrys would be doing that via private helicopter. Kidnapping is a federal offense, she said. If you take me out of here against my will, that's kidnapping. And I'll press charges too. Cameron ignored her as he pulled a walkie-talkie out of his jacket pocket and clicked it on. You can pick us up now. For one heady moment Abby tried to tell herself that by us he meant the four of them. They'd take the chopper out of here and leave her in the clearing with Donald. We'll have 2 extra passengers. Her brief hope died. What about Roarke? He'll come back here and won't know what happened to us. Cameron gave her an icy smile. That wouldn't be polite, would it? Thanks for reminding me. I'll leave Wallace a nice